Chapter 61. A Discovery. The days when I frequented that miserable corner which my dear girl brightened can never fade in my remembrance. I never see it, and I never wish to see it now. I have only been there once since, but in my memory there is a mournful glory shining on the place, which will shine for ever. Not a day passed without my going there, of course. At first I found Mr. Skimpole there on 2 or 3 occasions, idly playing the piano and talking in his usual vivacious strain. Now, besides my very much mistrusting the probability of his being there without making Richard poorer, I felt as if there was something in his careless gaiety too inconsistent with what I knew of the depths of Ada's life. I clearly perceived, too, that Ada shared my feelings. I therefore resolved, after much thinking of it, to make a private visit to Mr. Skimpole, and to try delicately to explain myself. My dear girl was the great consideration that made me bold. I set off one morning, accompanied by Charlie, for Somerstown. As I approached the house, I was strongly inclined to turn back, for I felt what a desperate attempt it was to make an impression on Mr. Skimpole, and how extremely likely it was that he would signally defeat me. However, I thought that being there, I would go through with it. I knocked with a trembling hand at Mr. Skimpole's door, literally with a hand, for the knocker was gone, and after a long parley gained admission from an Irishwoman who was in the area when I knocked, breaking up the lid of a water butt with a poker to light the fire with. Mr. Skimpole, lying on the sofa in his room, playing the flute a little, was enchanted to see me. Now, who should receive me, he asked. Who would I prefer for mistress of the ceremonies? Would I have his comedy daughter, his beauty daughter, or his sentiment daughter? Or would I have all the daughters at once in perfect nosegay? I replied, half defeated already, that I wished to speak to himself only if he would give me leave. "Why, dear Miss Summerson, most joyfully, of course," he said, bringing his chair nearer to mine and breaking into his fascinating smile. "Of course it's not business, then it's pleasure." I said it certainly was not business that I came upon, but it was not quite a pleasant matter. "Then, my dear Miss Summerson," said he with the frankest gaiety, "don't allude to it. Why should you allude to anything that is not a pleasant matter? I never do, and you are a much pleasanter creature in every point of view than I. You are perfectly pleasant. I am imperfectly pleasant. Then if I never allude to an unpleasant matter, how much less should you, so that it's disposed of, and we will talk of something else." Although I was embarrassed, I took courage to intimate that I still wished to pursue the subject. "I should think that a mistake," said Mr. Skimpole with his airy laugh, "if I thought Miss Summerson capable of making one, but I don't." "Mr. Skimpole," said I, raising my eyes to his, "I have often heard you say that you are unacquainted with the common affairs of life." "Meaning our 3 banking-house friends, L, S, and who's the junior partner? D," said Mr. Skimpole brightly. "Not an idea of them." "That, perhaps," I went on, "you will excuse my boldness on that account. I think you ought to most seriously know that Richard is poorer than he was." "Dear me," said Mr. Skimpole, "so am I, they tell me, and in very embarrassed circumstances." "Parallel case exactly," said Mr. Skimpole with a delighted countenance. "This at present naturally causes Ada much secret anxiety, as I think she is less anxious when no claims are made upon her by visitors, and as Richard has one uneasiness always heavy on his mind, it had occurred to me to take the liberty of saying that if you would not—" I was coming to the point with great difficulty, when he took me by both hands, and with a radiant face and in the liveliest way anticipated it. "Not go there? Certainly not, my dear Miss Summerson. Most assuredly not. Why should I go there? When I go anywhere, I go for pleasure. I don't go anywhere for pain, because I was made for pleasure. Pain comes to me when it wants me. Now, I have had very little pleasure at our dear Richard's lately, and your practical sagacity demonstrates why. Our young friends, losing the youthful poetry which was once so captivating in them, begin to think This is a man who wants pounds. So am I. I always want pounds, not for myself, but because tradespeople always want them of me. Next, our young friends began to think becoming mercenary. This is the man who had pounds, who borrowed them, which I did. I always borrow pounds. So our young friends, reduced to prose, which is much to be regretted, degenerate in their power of imparting pleasure to me. Why should I go to see them, therefore? Absurd. Through the beaming smile with which he regarded me, he reasoned thus. There now broke forth a look of disinterested benevolence quite astonishing. Besides, he said, pursuing his argument in his tone of light-hearted conviction, if I don't go anywhere for pain, which would be a perversion of the intention of my being, and a monstrous thing to do, why should I go anywhere to be the cause of pain? If I went to see our young friends in their present ill-regulated state of mind, I should give them pain. The associations with me would be disagreeable. They might say, this is the man who had pounds and who can't pay pounds, which I can't, of course. Nothing could be more out of the question. Then kindness requires that I shouldn't go near them, and I won't. He finished by genially kissing my hand and thanking me. Nothing but Miss Summerson's fine tact, he said, would have found this out for him. I was much disconcerted, but I reflected that if the main point were gained, it mattered little how strangely he perverted everything leading to it. I had determined to mention something else, however, and I thought I was not to be put off in that. Mr. Skimpole, said I must take the liberty of saying before I conclude my visit that I was much surprised to learn, on the best authority, some little time ago, that you knew with whom that poor boy left Bleak House, and that you accepted a present on that occasion. I have not mentioned it to my guardian, for I fear it would hurt him unnecessarily, but I may say to you that I was much surprised. No, really surprised, my dear Miss Summerson, he returned inquiringly, raising his pleasant eyebrows. Greatly surprised. He thought about it for a little while, with a highly agreeable and whimsical expression on his face, and then quite gave it up, and said in his most engaging manner, You know what a child I am. Why surprised? I was reluctant to enter minutely into that question, but as he begged I would, for he was really curious to know, I gave him to understand, in the gentlest words I could use, that his conduct seemed to involve a disregard of several moral obligations. He was much amused and interested when he had heard this, and said, Not really, with his ingenuous simplicity. You know I don't intend to be responsible. I never could do it. Responsibility is a thing that has always been above me, or below me, said Mr. Skimpole. I don't even know which, but as I understand the way in which my dear Miss Summerson, always remarkable for her practical good sense and clearness, puts this case, I should imagine it was chiefly a question of money. Do you know? I incautiously gave a qualified assent to this. Ah, then you see, said Mr. Skimpole, shaking his head, I'm hopeless of understanding it. I suggested as I rose to go that it was not right to betray my guardian's confidence for a bribe. My dear Miss Summerson, he returned with a candid hilarity that was all his own, I can't be bribed. Not by Mr. Bucket, said I. No, said he, not by anybody. I don't attach any value to money. I don't care about it. I don't know about it. I don't want it. I don't keep it. It goes away from me directly. How can I be bribed? I showed that I was of a different opinion, though I had not the capacity for arguing the question. On the contrary, said Mr. Skimpole, I am exactly the man to be placed in a superior position in such a case as that. I am above the rest of mankind in such a case as that. I can act with philosophy in such a case as that. I am not warped by my prejudice, as an Italian baby is by bandages. I am as free as the air. I feel myself far above suspicion as Caesar's wife. Anything equal to the lightness of his manner and the playful impartiality with which he seemed to convince himself, as he tossed the matter about like a ball of feathers, was surely never seen in anybody else. Observe the case, my dear Miss Summerson. Here is a boy received into the house and put to bed in a state that I strongly object to. The boy being in bed, a man arrives, like the house that Jack built. Here is the man who demands the boy who is received into the house and be put to bed in a state that I strongly object to. Here is a banknote produced by the man who demands the boy, who is received into the house and put to bed in a state that I strongly object to. Here is the Skimpole who accepts the banknote produced by the man who demands the boy who is received into the house and put to bed in a state that I strongly object to. Those are the facts. Very well. Should the Skimpole have refused the note? Why should the Skimpole have refused the note? Skimpole protests to Bucket. What's this for? I don't understand it. It's of no use to me. Take it away. Bucket still entreats Skimpole to accept it. Are there reasons why Skimpole should not be warped by prejudice, should accept it? Yes, Skimpole perceives them. What are they? Skimpole reasons with himself. This is a tamed lynx, an active police officer, an intelligent man, a person of peculiarly directed energy and great subtlety both of conception and execution, who discovers our friends and enemies for us when they run away, recovers our property for us when we are robbed, avenges us comfortably when we are murdered. This active police officer and intelligent man has acquired, in the exercise of his art, a strong faith in money. He finds it very useful to him, and he makes it very useful to society. Shall I shake that faith in Bucket because I want it myself? Shall I deliberately blunt one of Bucket's weapons? Shall I positively paralyse Bucket in his next detective operation? And again, if it is blamable on Skimpole to take the note, it is blamable on Bucket to offer the note. Much more blamable in Bucket because he is the knowing man. Now Skimpole wishes to think well of Bucket. Skimpole deems it essential in its little place to the general cohesion of things that he should think well of Bucket. The State expressly asked him to trust Bucket, and he does, and that's all he does. I had nothing to offer in reply to this exposition, and therefore took my leave. Mr. Skimpole, however, who was in excellent spirits, would not hear of my returning home, attended only by little Coavinses, and accompanied me himself. He entertained me on the way with a variety of delightful conversation, and assured me at parting that he should never forget the fine tact with which I had found out that for him about our young friends. As it so happened, I never saw Mr. Skimpole again. I may at once finish what I know of his history. A coolness rose between him and my guardian, based principally on the foregoing grounds, and on his having heartlessly disregarded my guardian's entreaties, as we afterwards learned from Ada, in reference to Richard. His being heavily in my guardian's debt had nothing to do with their separation. He died some 5 years afterwards, and left a diary behind him, with letters and other materials towards his life, which was published, and which showed him to have been the victim of a combination on the part of mankind against an amiable child. It was considered very pleasant reading, but I never read more of it myself than the sentence on which I chanced to light on opening the book. It was this: Jarndyce, in common with most other men I have known, is the incarnation of selfishness. And now I come to a part of my story touching myself very nearly indeed, and for which I was quite unprepared when the circumstance occurred. Whatever little lingerings may now and then received in my mind associated with my poor old face had only revived as belonging to a part of my life that was gone like my infancy or my childhood. I have suppressed none of my many weaknesses on that subject, but have written them as faithfully as my memory has recalled them, and I hope to do, and mean to do, the same down to the last words of these pages, which I see now not so very far before me. The months were gliding away, and my dear girl, sustained by the hope she had confided in me, was the same beautiful star in the miserable corner. Richard, more worn and haggard, haunted the court day after day, listlessly sat there the whole day long, when he knew there was no remote chance of the suit being mentioned, and became one of the stock sights of the place. I wonder whether any of the gentlemen remembered him as he was when he first went there. So completely was he absorbed in his fixed idea that he used to avow in his cheerful moments that he should never have breathed the fresh air now but for Woodcourt. It was only Mr. Woodcourt who would occasionally divert his attention for a few hours at a time, and rouse him, even when he sunk into a lethargy of mind and body that alarmed us greatly. and the returns of which became more frequent as the months went on. My dear girl was right in saying that he only pursued his errors the more desperately for her sake. I have no doubt that his desire to retrieve what he had lost rendered the more intense by his grief for his young wife, and became like the madness of a gamester. I was there, as I have mentioned, at all hours. When I was there at night, I generally went home with Charlie in a coach. Sometimes my guardian would meet me in the neighbourhood, and we would walk home together. One evening he had arranged to meet me at 8 o'clock. I could not leave, as I usually did, quite punctually at the time, for I was working for my dear girl and had a few stitches more to finish what I was about. But it was within a few minutes of the hour when I bundled up my little work basket, gave my darling the last kiss for the night, and hurried downstairs. Mr. Woodcourt went with me, as it was dusk. When we came to the usual place of meeting, it was close by, and Mr. Woodcourt had often accompanied me before. My guardian was not there. We waited half an hour, walking up and down, but there were no signs of him. We agreed that he was either prevented from coming, or that he had come and gone away, and Mr. Woodcourt proposed to walk home with me. It was the first walk we had ever taken together, except that very short one to the usual place of meeting. We spoke of Richard and Ada the whole way. I did not thank him in words for what he had done. My appreciation of it had risen above all words then, but I hoped he might not be without some understanding of what I felt so strongly. Arriving at home and going upstairs, we found that my guardian was out, and that Mrs. Woodcourt was out too. We were in the very same room into which I had brought my blushing girl when her youthful lover, now her so altered husband, was the choice of her young heart. The very same room from which my guardian and I had watched them going away through the sunlight in the fresh bloom of their hope and promise. We were standing by the open window, looking down into the street, when Mr. Woodcourt spoke to me. I learned in a moment that he loved me. I learned in a moment that my scarred face was all unchanged to him. I learnt in a moment that what I had thought was pity and compassion was devoted, generous, faithful love. Oh, too late to know it now. Too late, too late. That was the first ungrateful thought I had. Too late. When I returned, he told me, when I came back no richer than when I went away, and found you newly risen from a sick bed, yet so inspired by sweet consideration for others, and so free from a selfish thought. Oh, Mr. Woodcourt, forbear, forbear, I entreated him. I do not deserve your high praise. I had many selfish thoughts at that time, many. Heaven knows, beloved of my life, said he, that my praise is not a lover's praise, but the truth. You do not know what all around you see in Esther Summerson, how many hearts she touches and awakens, what sacred admiration and what love she wins. Oh, Mr. Woodcourt, cried I, it's a great thing to win love. It is a great thing to win love. I am proud of it and honoured by it, and the hearing of it causes me to shed those tears of mingled joy and sorrow. Joy that I have won it, sorrow that I have not deserved it better, but I am not free to think of yours. I said it with a stronger heart, for when he praised me thus, and when I heard his voice thrill with his belief that what he said was true, I aspired to be more worthy of it. It was not too late for that, although I close this unforeseen page in my life tonight. I could be worthier of it through all my life, and it was a comfort to me, an impulse to me, and I felt a dignity rise up within me that was derived from him when I thought so. He broke the silence. I should poorly show the trust that I have in the dear one who will evermore be as dear to me as now. And the deep earnestness with which he said it at once strengthened me and made me weep. If, after her assurance that she is not free to think of my love, I urged it, dear Esther, let me only tell you that the fond idea of you which I took abroad was exalted to the heavens when I came home. I have always hoped, in the first hour when I seemed to stand in any ray of good fortune, to tell you this. I have always feared that I should tell you in vain. My hopes and fears are both fulfilled tonight. I distress you. I have said enough. Something seemed to pass into my place that was like an angel he thought me, and I felt so sorrowful for the loss he had sustained. I wished to help him in his trouble, as I had wished to do when he showed me that first commiseration for me.
Dear Mr. Woodcourt, said I, before we part tonight, something is left for me to say. Never could I say it as I wish. I never shall, but I had to think again of being more deserving of his love and his affliction before I could go on. I am deeply sensible of your generosity, and I shall treasure its remembrance to my dying hour. I know full well how changed I am. I know you are not unacquainted with my history, and I know what a noble love that is which is so faithful. What you have said to me could have affected me so much from no other lips, for there are none that could give it such a value to me. I shall not be lost. It shall make me better. He covered his eyes with his hand and turned away his head. How could I ever be worthy of those tears? If in the unchanged intercourse we shall have together, in tending Richard and Ada, and I hope in many happier scenes of life, you ever find anything in me which you can honestly think is better than it used to be, believe that it will have sprung up from tonight, and that I shall owe it to you. And never believe, dear Mr. Woodcourt, never believe that I forget this night, or that, while my heart beats, it can be insensible to the pride and joy of having been beloved by you. He took my hand and kissed it. He was like himself again, and I felt still more encouraged. I am induced by what you said just now, said I, to hope that you have succeeded in your endeavour. I have, he answered. With such help from Mr. Jarndyce as you, who know him so well, can imagine him to have rendered me, I have succeeded. Heaven bless him for it, said I, giving him my hand, and heaven bless you in all you do. I should do it better for the wish, he answered. It will make me enter on these new duties as on another sacred trust from you. Ah, Richard, I exclaimed involuntarily, what will he do when you are gone? I am not required to go yet. I would not desert him, dear Miss Summerson, even if I were. One other thing I felt it needful to touch upon before he left me. I knew that I should not be worthier of the love I could not take if I reserved it. Mr. Woodcourt, said I, you will be glad to know from my lips before I say good night, in that future which is clear and bright before me, I am most happy, most fortunate, have nothing to regret or desire. It was indeed a glad hearing to him, he replied. From my childhood I have been, said I, the object of the untiring goodness of the best of human beings, to whom I am so bound by every tie of attachment, gratitude, and love, that nothing I could do in the compass of a life could express the feelings of a single day. I share those feelings, he returned. You speak of Mr. Jarndyce. You know his virtues well, said I, but few can know the greatness of his character as I know it. All its highest and best qualities have been revealed to me in nothing more brightly than in shaping out that future in which I am so happy. And if your highest homage and respect had not been his already, which I know they are, they would have been his, I think, on this assurance, and in the feeling that it would have awakened in you towards him for my sake. He fervently replied that indeed they would have been. I gave him my hand again. Good night, I said. Good bye. The first until we meet tomorrow, the second as a farewell to this theme between us for ever. Yes, good night, good bye. He left me, and I stood in the dark window watching the street. His love, in all its constancy and generosity, had come so suddenly upon me that he had not left me a minute when my fortitude gave way again, and the street was blotted out by my rushing tears. But they were not tears of regret and sorrow. No, he had called me the beloved of his life, and I had said I would be evermore as dear to him as I was then, and I felt as if my heart would not hold the triumph of having heard those words. My first wild thought had died away. It was not too late to hear them, for it was not too late to be animated by them, to be good, true, grateful, and contented. How easy my path, how much easier than his. Chapter 62. Another Discovery. I had not the courage to see anyone that night. I had not even the courage to see myself, for I was afraid that my tears might a little reproach me. I went up to my room in the dark, and prayed in the dark, and lay down in the dark to sleep. I had no need of any light to read my guardian's letter by, for I knew it by heart. I took it from the place where I kept it, and repeated its contents by its own clear light of integrity and love, and went to sleep with it on my pillow. I was up very early in the morning, and called Charlie to come for a walk. We bought flowers for the breakfast table, came back and arranged them, and we were as busy as possible. We were so early that I had a good time still for Charlie's lesson before breakfast. Charlie, who was not the least improved in the old defective article of grammar, came through with great applause, and we were altogether very notable. When my guardian appeared, and he said, "Why, little woman, you look fresher than your flowers," and Mrs. Woodcourt repeated and translated a passage from the Llewellyn Willinwodd, expressive of my being like a mountain with the sun upon it. This was all so pleasant that I hope it made me still more like the mountain than I had been before. After breakfast I waited my opportunity and peeped about a little until I saw my guardian in his own room, the room of last night, by himself. Then I made an excuse to go in with my housekeeping keys, shutting the door after me. "Well, Dame Durden," said my guardian. The post had brought him several letters, and he was writing. "You want money?" "No, indeed, I have plenty at hand." "There never was such a Dame Durden," said my guardian, "for making money last." He had laid down his pen and leaned back in his chair, looking at me. I have often spoken of his bright face, but I thought I had never seen it look so bright and good. There was a high happiness upon it which made me think he has been doing some great kindness this morning. "There never was," said my guardian, musing as he smiled upon me, "such a Dame Durden for making money last." He had never yet altered his old manner. I loved it and him so much that when I now went up to him and took my usual chair, which was always put at his side, for sometimes I read to him, and sometimes I talked to him, and sometimes I silently worked by him, I hardly liked to disturb it by laying my hand on his breast, but I found I did not disturb it at all. "Dear guardian," said I want to speak to you. Have I been remiss in anything?" "Remiss in anything, my dear? Have I not been what I meant to be since I brought the answer to your letter, guardian?" "You have been everything I could desire, my love." "I am very glad to hear that," I returned. "You know you said to me, 'Was this the mistress of Bleak House?' and I said, 'Yes.'" "Yes," said my guardian, nodding his head. He put his arm about me as if there were something to protect me from, and looked in my face, smiling. "Since then," said I, "we have never spoken on the subject except once." "And then I said Bleak House was thinning fast, and so it was, my dear." "And I said," I timidly reminded him, "but its mistress remained." He held me in the same protecting manner, with the same bright goodness in his face. "Dear guardian," said I know how you have felt all that has happened, and how considerate you have been, and so much time has passed, and as you spoke of only this morning of my being so well again, perhaps you expect me to renew the subject. Perhaps I ought to do so. I will be the mistress of Bleak House when you please." "See," he returned gaily, "what a sympathy there must be between us. I have had nothing else, poor Rick excepted, it's a large exception, in my mind. When you came in I was full of it. When shall we give Bleak House its mistress, little woman?" "When you please. Next month?" "Next month, dear guardian." "The day on which I take the happiest and best step of my life. The day on which I shall be a man more exulting and more enviable than any other man in the world. The day on which I give Bleak House its little mistress shall be next month, then," said my guardian. I put my arms round his neck and kissed him, just as I had done on the day when I brought my answer. A servant came to the door to announce Mr. Bucket, which was quite unnecessary, for Mr. Bucket was already looking over the servant's shoulder. "Mr. Jarndyce, Mr. Summerson," said he, rather out of breath. "Apologies for intruding. Will you allow me to order up a person that's on the stairs, and that objects to being left there in case of becoming the subject of observations in his absence?" "Thank you. Be so good as to chair that member in this direction, will you?" said Mr. Bucket, beckoning over the banisters. The singular request produced an old man in a black skull cap, unable to walk, who was carried up by a couple of bearers and deposited in the room near the door. Mr. Bucket immediately got rid of the bearers, mysteriously shut the door, and bolted it. "Now you see, Mr. Jarndyce," he then began, putting down his hat and opening his subject with a flourish of his well-remembered finger, "you know me. Miss Summerson knows me. This gentleman likewise knows me, and his name is Smallweed. The discounting line is his principally, and he's what you might call a dealer in bills. That's about what you are, you know, ain't you?" said Mr. Bucket. stopping a little to address the gentleman in question, who was exceedingly suspicious of him. He seemed about to dispute the designation of himself, when he was seized with a violent fit of coughing. "No moral, you know," said Mr. Bucket, improving the accident. "Don't you contradict when there ain't no occasion, and you won't be took in that way. Now, Mr. Jarndyce, I address myself to you. I've been negotiating with this gentleman on behalf of Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, and one way and another I've been in and out and about his premises a deal. His premises are the premises formerly occupied by Crook, a marine store dealer, a relation of this gentleman's, that you saw in his lifetime, if I don't mistake." My guardian replied, "Yes." "Well, you are to understand," said Mr. Bucket, "that this gentleman, he come into Crook's property, and a good deal of magpie property there was, vast lots of waste paper among the rest, Lord bless you, of no use to anybody." The cunning of Mr. Bucket's eye, and the masterly manner in which he contrived, without a look or a word against which his watchful auditor could protest, to let us know that he stated the case according to previous agreement, and could say much more of Mr. Smallweed if he thought it advisable, deprived of us any merit in quite understanding him. His difficulty was increased by Mr. Smallweed's being deaf as well as suspicious, and watching his face with the closest attention. "Among them old heaps of papers, this gentleman, when he comes into the property, naturally begins to rummage, don't you see?" said Mr. Bucket. "To which? Say that again," cried Mr. Smallweed, with a shrill, sharp voice. "To rummage," repeated Mr. Bucket. "Being a prudent man, and accustomed to take care of your own affairs, you begin to rummage among the papers as you have come into, don't you?" "Of course I do," cried Mr. Smallweed. "Of course you do," said Mr. Bucket conversationally, "and much to blame you would be if you didn't. And so you chance to find, you know," Mr. Bucket went on, stooping over him with an air of cheerful raillery which Mr. Smallweed by no means reciprocated, "and you chance to find, you know, a paper with the signature of Jarndyce to it, don't you?" Mr. Smallweed glanced with a troubled eye at us, and grudgingly nodded assent. "And coming to look at that paper at your full leisure and convenience, all in good time, you're not curious to read it, and why should you be? What do you find it out to be but a will, you see? There's the drollery of it," said Mr. Bucket, with the same lively air of recalling a joke for the enjoyment of Mr. Smallweed, who still had the same crestfallen appearance of not enjoying it at all. "What did you find it out to be but a will?" "I don't know that it's as good as a will or as anything else," snarled Mr. Smallweed. Mr. Bucket eyed the old man for a moment. He had slipped and shrunk down into his chair into a mere bundle, as if he were much disposed to pounce upon him. Nevertheless, he continued to bend over him with the same agreeable air, keeping the corner of one of his eyes upon us. "Notwithstanding which," said Mr. Bucket, "you get a little doubtful and comfortable in your mind about it, having a very tender mind of your own." "Eh? What do you say? Have I got a mind of my own?" asked Mr. Smallweed, with his hand to his ear. "A very tender mind." "Oh, well, go on," said Mr. Smallweed. "And as you've heard a good deal mentioned regarding a celebrated chancery will of the case of the same name, and as you know what a card Crook was for buying all manner of old pieces of furniture and books and papers and what not, and never liking to part with them, and always a going to teach himself to read, you begin to think, and you never was more correct in your born days, ecod, if I don't look about me, I may get into trouble regarding this will." "Now mind how you put it, Bucket," cried the old man anxiously, with his hand to his ear. "Speak up. None of your brimstone tricks. Pick me up. I want to hear better. Oh, Lord, I'm shaken to bits." Mr. Bucket had certainly picked him up at a dart. However, as soon as he could be heard through Smallweed's coughing and his vicious ejaculations of "Oh, my bones! Oh, dear! I've no breath in my body! I'm worse than a chattering, clattering brimstone pig at home," Mr. Bucket proceeded in the same convivial manner as before. "So, as I happen to be in the habit of coming to your premises, you take me into your confidence, don't you?" I think it would be impossible to make an admission with more ill will and a worse grace than Mr. Smallweed displayed when he admitted this, rendering it perfectly evident that Mr. Bucket was the very last person he would have thought of taking into his confidence, if he could by any possibility have kept him out of it. "And I go into the business with you, and very pleasant we are over it, and I confirm you in all your well-founded fears that you will get yourself into a most precious line "If you don't come out with that there will," said Mr. Bucket emphatically. "And accordingly you arrange with me that I shall be delivered up to this present Mr. Jarndyce on no conditions. That if it should prove to be valuable, you trusting yourself to him for your reward, that's about where it's at, ain't it?" "That's what was agreed," Mr. Smallwood assented with the same bad grace. "In consequence of which," said Mr. Bucket, dismissing his agreeable manner all at once, becoming strictly businesslike, "you've got that will upon your person at the present time, and the only thing that remains for you to do is to just out with it." Having given us one glance at the watching corner of his eye, and having given his nose one triumphant rub with his forefinger, Mr. Bucket stood with his eyes fastened upon his confidential friend, and his hand stretched forth ready to take the paper and present it to my guardian. It was not produced without much reluctance and many declarations on the part of Mr. Smallweed that he was a poor industrious man, and that he left it to Mr. Jarndyce's honour not to let him lose by his honesty. Little by little he very slowly took from a breast pocket a stained, discoloured paper, which was much singed on the outside, a little burnt at the edges, as if it had long ago been thrown upon a fire and hastily snatched off again. Mr. Bucket lost no time in transferring this paper, with the dexterity of a conjurer, from Mr. Smallweed to Mr. Jarndyce. As he gave it to my guardian, he whispered behind his fingers, "Hadn't settled how to make their market of it, quarrelled and hinted about it. I laid out £20 upon it. First, the avaricious grandchildren split upon him on account of their objections to his living so unreasonably long, and then they split on one another. Lord, there ain't one of the family that wouldn't sell the other for £1 or two, and except the old lady. She's only out of it because she's too weak in her mind to drive a bargain." "Mr. Bucket," said my guardian aloud, "whatever the worth of this paper may be to any one, my obligations are great to you, and if it be of any worth, I hold myself bound to see Mr. Smallweed remunerated accordingly." "Not according to your merits, you know," said Mr. Bucket in a friendly explanation to Mr. Smallweed. "Don't you be afraid of that. According to its value." "That's what I mean," said my guardian. "You may observe, Mr. Bucket, that I abstain from examining this paper myself. The plain truth is, I have forsworn and abjured the whole business these many years, and my soul is sick of it. But Miss Summerson and I will immediately place the paper in the hands of my solicitor in the cause, and its existence shall be made known without delay to all other parties interested." "Mr. Jarndyce can't say fairer than that, you understand," observed Mr. Bucket to his fellow visitor. "And it being now made clear to you that nobody's going to be wrong, which must be a great relief to your mind, we may proceed with the ceremony of chairing you home again." He unbolted the door and called in the bearers, wished us a good morning, and with a look full of meaning and a crook of his finger at parting went his way. We went our way too, which was to Lincoln's Inn, as quickly as possible. Mr. Kenge was disengaged, and we found him at his table in his dusty room, with the inexpressive-looking books and the piles of papers. Chairs having been placed for us by Mr. Guppy, Mr. Kenge expressed the surprise and gratification he felt at the unusual sight of Mr. Jarndyce in his office. He turned over his double eyeglass as he spoke, and was more conversation Kenge than ever. "I hope," said Mr. Kenge, "that the genial influence of Miss Summerson," he bowed to me, "may have induced Mr. Jarndyce," he bowed to him, "to forego some little of his animosity towards a court which take their place in the stately vista of the pillars of our profession." "I am inclined to think," returned my guardian, "that Miss Summerson has seen too much of the effects of the court and the cause to exert any influence in their favour. Nevertheless, they are part of the occasion of my being here. Mr. Kenge, before I lay this paper on your desk and have done with it, let me tell you how it has come into my hand." He did so shortly and distinctly. "It could not, sir," said Mr. Kenge, "have been stated more plainly and to the purpose, as if it had been a case at law." "Did you ever know English law, or equity either, plain and to the purpose?" said my guardian. "Oh, fie!" said Mr. Kenge. At first he had not seemed to attach much importance to the paper, but when he saw it he appeared more interested, and when he had opened and read a little of it through his eyeglass he became amazed. "Mr. Jarndyce," he said, looking off it, "you have perused this?" "Not I," said my guardian. "But, my dear sir," said Mr. Kenge, "it is a will of a later date than any in the suit. It appears to be all in the testator's handwriting, and is duly executed and attested. And even if intended to be cancelled, as might possibly be supposed to be denoted by these marks of fire, it is not cancelled. Here it is, a perfect instrument." "Well," said my guardian, "what's that to me?" "Mr. Guppy," cried Mr. Kenge, raising his voice. "Beg your pardon, Mr. Jarndyce." "Sir?" "Mr. Vholes of Symonds Inn. Compliments, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Glad to speak with him." Mr. Guppy disappeared. "You ask me what this is to you, Mr. Jarndyce. If you had perused this document, you would have seen that it reduces your interest considerably, though still leaving it a very handsome one." "Still leaving it a very handsome one," said Mr. Kenge, waving his hand persuasively and blandly. "You would further have seen that the interests of Mr. Richard Carstone and of Miss Ada Clare, now Mrs. Richard Carstone, are very materially advanced by it." "Kenge," said my guardian, "if all the flourishing wealth that the suit brought into this vile court of chancery could fall to my two young cousins, I should be well contented. But do you ask me to believe that any good is to come of Jarndyce and Jarndyce?" "Oh, really, Mr. Jarndyce, prejudice, prejudice, my dear sir. This is a very great country, a very great country. Its system of equity is a very great system, really, really." My guardian said no more. Mr. Vholes arrived. He was modestly impressed by Mr. Kenge's professional eminence. "How do you do, Mr. Vholes? Will you be so good as to take a chair here by me and look over this paper?" Mr. Vholes did as he was asked, and seemed to read it every word. He was not excited by it, but he was not excited by anything. When he had well examined it, he retired with Mr. Kenge into a window, and, shading his mouth with his black glove, spoke to him at some length. I was not surprised to observe Mr. Kenge inclined to dispute what he said before he had said much more, for I knew that no two people ever did agree about anything in Jarndyce and Jarndyce. But he seemed to have got the better of Mr. Kenge, too, in a conversation that sounded as if it were almost composed of the words Receiver General, Accountant General, Report, Estate, and Costs. When they had finished, they came back to Mr. Kenge's table and spoke aloud. "Well, this is a very remarkable document, Mr. Vholes," said Mr. Kenge. Mr. Vholes said, "Very much so." "A very important document, Mr. Vholes," said Mr. Kenge. Again Mr. Vholes said, "Very much so." "And as you say, Mr. Vholes, when the cause is in the paper next term, this document will be an unexpected and interesting feature in it," said Mr. Kenge, looking loftily at my guardian. Vholes was gratified as a small practitioner striving to keep it respectable to be confirmed in any opinion of his own by such an authority. "And when," asked my guardian, rising after a pause, during which Mr. Kenge had rattled his money and Mr. Vholes had picked his pimples, "when is next term?" "Next term, Mr. Jarndyce, will be next month," said Mr. Kenge. "Of course we shall at once proceed to do what is necessary with this document, and to collect the necessary evidence concerning it. Of course you will receive your usual notification of the cause being in the paper, to which I shall pay, of course, my usual attention." "Still bent, my dear sir," said Mr. Kenge, showing us through the outer office to the door, "still bent, even with your enlarged mind, on echoing a popular prejudice. We are a prosperous community, Mr. Jarndyce, a very prosperous community. We are a great country, Mr. Jarndyce. We are a very great country. This is a great system, Mr. Jarndyce, and you would wish a great country to have a little system. Now, really, really." He said this at the stair head, gently moving his right hand as if it were a silver trowel with which to spread the cement of his words on the structure of the system and consolidate it for 1,000 ages. Chapter 63. Steel and Iron. George's shooting gallery is to let, and the stock is sold on, and George himself is at Chesney Wold, attending on Sir Leicester in his rides, and riding very near his bridle rein because of the uncertain hand with which he guides his horse. But not to-day is George so occupied. He is journeying to-day into the iron country further north, to look about him. As he comes into the iron country further north, such fresh green woods as those of Chesney Wold are left behind, and coal pits and ashes, high chimneys and red bricks, blighted verdure, scorching fires, and a heavy, never lightening cloud of smoke becomes the features of the scenery. Among such objects rides the trooper, looking about him, and always looking for something he has come to find. At last, on the black canal bridge of a busy town, with a clang of iron in it, and more fires and more smoke than he has seen yet, the trooper, swart with the dust of the cold roads, checks his horse and asks a workman does he know the name of Rouncewell thereabouts. "Why, master," quoth the workman, "do I know my own name?" "'Tis so well known here, is it, comrade?" asked the trooper. "Rouncewell's? Ah, you're right." "And where might it be now?" asked the trooper with a glance before him. "The bank, the factory, or the house?" the workman wants to know. Rouncewell is so great apparently," mutters the trooper, stroking his chin, "that I have as good as half a mind to go back again. Why, I don't know which I want. Should I find Mr. Rouncewell at the factory, do you think? It ain't easy to say where you'd find him at this time of the day. You might find him either or his son there, if he's in town, but his contracts take him away. And which is the factory? Why, he sees those chimneys, the tallest ones. Yes, he sees them. Well, let him keep his eye on those chimneys, going on as straight as he ever can, and presently he'll see him down a turning on the left, shut in by a great brick wall which forms one side of the street. That's Rouncewell's." The trooper thanks his informant and rides slowly on, looking about him. He does not turn back, puts up his horse, and is much disposed to groom him too, at a public house where some of Rouncewell's hands are dining, as the ostler tells him. Some of Rouncewell's hands have just knocked off for dinner time, and seem to be invading the whole town. They are very sinewy and strong, are Rouncewell's hands, a little sooty too. He comes to a gateway in the brick wall, looks in, and sees a great perplexity of iron lying about in every stage, and in a vast variety of shapes, in bars, in wedges, in sheets, in tanks, in boilers, in axles, in wheels, in cogs, in cranks, in rails, twisted and wrenched into eccentric and perverse forms, the separate parts of machinery, mountains of it broken up and rusty in its aid, distant furnaces of it glowing and bubbling its youth, bright fireworks of it showering about under the blows of the steam hammer, red hot iron, white hot iron, cold black iron, an iron taste, an iron smell, and a babel of iron sounds. "This is a place to make a man's head ache too," says the trooper, looking about him for a counting house. "Who comes here? This is very like me before I was set up. This ought to be my nephew. If likenesses run in families, your servant, sir." "Yours, sir? Are you looking for anyone? Excuse me, young Mr. Rouncewell, I believe." "Yes, I was looking for your father, sir. I wish to have a word with him." The young man, telling him he is fortunate in his choice of a time, for his father is there, leads the way to the office where he is to be found. Very like me before I was set up. Devilish like me, thinks the trooper as he follows. They come to a building in the yard with an office on an upper floor. At sight of the gentleman in the office, Mr. George turns very red. "What name shall I say to my father?" asks the young man. George, full of the idea of iron, in desperation answers Steel, and is so presented. He is left alone with the gentleman in the office, who sits at a table with account books before him, and some sheets of paper blotted with hosts of figures and drawings of cunning shapes. It's a bare office, with bare windows, looking on the iron view below, purposely broken to be tested at various periods of their service, in various capacities. There is iron dust on everything, and the smoke is seen through the windows, rolling heavily out of the tall chimneys, to mingle with the smoke from a vaporous Babylon of other chimneys. "I'm at your service, Mr. Steele," says the gentleman when his visitor has taken a rusty chair. "Well, Mr. Rouncewell," George replies, leaning forward with his left arm on his knee and his hat in his hand, and very chary of meeting his brother's eye, "I am not without my expectations that in the present visit I may prove to be more free than welcome. I have served as a dragoon in my day, and a comrade of mine that I was once rather partial to was, if I don't deceive myself, a brother of yours. I believe you had a brother who gave his family some trouble and ran away, and never did any good but in keeping away." "Are you quite sure," returns the ironmaster in an altered voice, "that your name is Steele?" The trooper falters and looks at him. His brother starts up, calls him by his name, and grasps him by both hands. "You're too quick for me," cries the trooper, with a tear springing out of his eyes. "How do you do, my dear old fellow? I never could have thought you would have been half so glad to see me as all this. How do you do, my dear old fellow? How do you do?" They shake hands and embrace each other over and over again, the trooper still coupling his "How do you do, my dear old fellow," with his protestation that he never thought his brother would have been half so glad to see him as all this. "So far from it," he declares at the end of a full account of what has preceded his arrival there, "I had very little idea of making myself known. I thought, if you took by any means forgivingly to my name, I might gradually get myself up to the point of writing a letter. But I should not have been surprised, brother, if you had considered anything but welcome news to hear of me." "We will show you at home what kind of news we think it, George," returns his brother. "This is a great day at home, and you could not have arrived, you bronzed old soldier, on a better. I make an agreement with my son Wat today that on his day 12 he shall marry as pretty and as good a girl as you have seen in all your travels. She goes to Germany tomorrow with one of your nieces for a little polishing up in her education. We make a feast of the event, and you will be made the hero of it." Mr. George is so entirely overcome at first by this prospect that he resists the proposed honour with great earnestness. Being overborne, however, by his brother and his nephew, concerning whom he renews his protestations that he never could have thought they would have been half so glad to see him, he is taken home to an elegant house, in all the arrangements of which there is to be observed a pleasant mixture of the original simple habits of the father and mother with such as are suited to their altered station and higher fortunes of their children. Here Mr. George is much dismayed by the graces and accomplishments of his nieces that are, and by the beauty of Rosa, his niece that is to be, and by the affectionate salutations of these young ladies which he receives in a sort of a dream. He is sorely taken aback, too, by the dutiful behaviour of his nephew, and has a woeful consciousness upon him of being a scapegrace. However, there is a great rejoicing and very hearty company and infinite enjoyment. Mr. George comes bluff and martial through it all, and his pledge to be present at the marriage and give away the bride is received with universal favour. A whirling head has Mr. George that night when he lies down in the state bed of his brother's house, to think of all these things and to see the images of his nieces, awful all the evening in their floating muslins, waltzing after the German manner over his counterpane. The brothers are closeted next morning in the ironmaster's room, where the elder is proceeding in a clear, sensible way to show how he thinks he may best dispose of George in his business, when George squeezes his hand and stops him. "Brother, I thank you a million times for your more than brotherly welcome, and a million times more to that for your more than brotherly intentions. But my plans are made. Before I say a word as to them, I wish to consult you upon one family point." "How," says the trooper, folding his arms and looking with indomitable firmness at his brother, "how is my mother to be got to scratch me?" "I'm not sure that I understand you, George," replies the ironmaster. "I say, brother, how is my mother to be got to scratch me? She must be got to do it somehow." "Scratch you out of her will, I think you mean." "Of course I do. In short," says the trooper, folding his arms more resolutely yet, "I mean to scratch me." "My dear George," returns his brother, "is it so indispensable that you should undergo that process?" "Quite, absolutely. I couldn't be guilty of the meanness of coming back without it. I should never be safe not to be off again. I have not sneaked home to rob your children, if not yourself, brother, of your rights. I, who forfeited mine long ago. If I am to remain and hold up my head, I must be scratched. Come, you're a man of celebrated penetration and intelligence, and you can tell me how it's to be brought about." "I can tell you, George," replies the ironmaster deliberately, "how it is not to be brought about, which I hope may answer the purpose as well. Look at our mother. Think of her. Recall her emotion when she recovered you. Do you believe there is a consideration in the world that would induce her to take such a step against her favourite son? Do you believe there is any chance of her consent to balance against the outrage it would be to her loving, dear old lady to propose it? If you do, you are wrong. No, George, you must make up your mind to remain unscratched, I think." There is an amused smile on the ironmaster's face as he watches his brother, who is pondering, deeply disappointed. I think you may manage almost as well as if the thing were done, though. How, brother? Being bent upon it, you can dispose by will of anything you have the misfortune to inherit in any way you like, you know. That's true, says the trooper, pondering again. That's true, says the trooper, pondering again. Then he wistfully asked, with his hand on his brother's, would you mind mentioning that, brother, to your wife and family? Not at all. Thank you. You wouldn't object to say, perhaps, although an undoubted vagabond, I am a vagabond of the harum-scarum order, and not of the mean sort. The ironmaster, repressing his amused smile, assents. Thank you, thank you. It's a weight off my mind, says the trooper with a heave of his chest, as he unfolds his arms and puts a hand on each leg. Oh, I had set my heart on being scratched too. The brothers are very like each other, sitting face to face, but a certain massive simplicity and absence of usage in the ways of the world is all on the trooper's side. Well, he proceeds, showing off his disappointment, next and last, those plans are mine. You've been so brotherly as to propose to me to fall in here and take my place among the products of your perseverance and sense. I thank you heartily. It's more than brotherly, as I said before, and I thank you heartily for it, shaking him a long time by the hand. But the truth is, brother, I'm a kind of a weed, and it's too late to plant me in a regular garden. My dear George, returns the elder, concentrating his strong, steady brow upon him and smiling confidently, leave that to me and let me try. George shakes his head. You could do it, I have not a doubt, if anybody could, but it's not to be done. Not to be done, sir. Whereas it so falls out, on the other hand, that I am able to be of some trifle use to Sylvester Dedlock since his illness, brought on by family sorrows, that he would rather have that help from our mother's son than from anybody else. Well, my dear George, returns the other with a very slight shade upon his open face, if you prefer to serve in Sylvester Dedlock's household brigade. There it is, brother, cries the trooper, checking him with his hand upon his knee again. There it is. You don't take kindly to that idea. I don't mind it. You're not used to being officered. I am. Everything about you is in perfect order and discipline. Everything about me requires to be kept so. We're not accustomed to carry things with the same hand or to look at them from the same point. I don't say much about my garrison manners because I found myself pretty well at my ease last night, and they wouldn't be noticed here, I dare say, once in a way. But I shall get on best at Chesney Wold, where there's more room for a weed than there is here, and the dear old lady will be made happy besides. Therefore, I accept of Sylvester Dedlock's proposals. When I come over next year to give away the bride, or whenever I come, I shall have the sense to keep the household brigade in ambuscade, and not to manoeuvre it on your ground. I thank you heartily again, and I'm proud to think of the Rouncewells as they'll be founded by you. You know yourself, George, says the elder brother, returning the grip of his hand, and perhaps you know me better than I know myself. Take your way, so that we don't quite lose one another again. Take your way. No fear of that, returns the trooper. Now, before I turn my horse's head homewards, brother, I will ask you, if you'll be so good, to look over a letter for me. I brought it with me to send from these parts, as Chesney Wold might be a painful name just now to the person it's written to. I'm not much accustomed to correspondence myself, and I am particular respecting this present letter, because I want it to be both straightforward and delicate. Herewith he hands the letter, closely written in some pale ink, but in a neat round hand, to the ironmaster, who reads as follows. Miss Esther Summerson, the communication having been made to me by Inspector Bucket of a letter to myself being found among the papers of a certain person, I take the liberty to make it known to you that it was but a few lines of instruction from abroad, when, where, and how to deliver an enclosed letter to a young and beautiful lady, then unmarried in England. I duly observed the same. I further take the liberty to make it known to you that it was got from me as a proof of handwriting only, and that otherwise I would not have given it up, as appearing to be the most harmless in my possession, without being previously shot through the heart. I further take the liberty to mention that if I could have supposed a certain unfortunate gentleman to have been in existence, I never could and never would have rested till I had discovered his retreat and shared my last farthing with him. as my duty and my inclination would equally have been. But he was officially reported drowned, and assuredly went over the side of a transport ship at night in an Irish harbour within a few hours of her arrival from the West Indies, as I have myself heard from both officers and men on board, and know to have been officially confirmed. I further take the liberty to state that in my humble quality as one of the rank and file, I am, and shall ever continue to be, your thoroughly devoted and admiring servant, and that I esteem the qualities you possess above all others far beyond the limits of the present dispatch. I have the honour to be, George. A little formal, observes the elder brother, refolding it with a puzzled face. But nothing that might not be sent to a pattern young lady, asks the younger. Nothing at all. Therefore it is sealed and deposited for posting among the iron correspondence of the day. This done, Mr. George takes a hearty farewell of the family party, and prepares to saddle and mount. His brother, however, unwilling to part with him so soon, proposes to ride with him in a light open carriage to the place where he will bait for the night, and there remain with him until morning. A servant riding for so much of the journey on the thoroughbred old grey from Chesney Wold, the offer being gladly accepted, is followed by a pleasant ride, a pleasant dinner, and a pleasant breakfast, all in brotherly communion. Then once more they shake hands long and heartily and part. The ironmaster turning his face to the smoke and fires, the trooper to the green country. Early in the afternoon the subdued sound of his heavy military trot is heard on the turf in the avenue as he rides on, with an imaginary clank and jingle of accoutrements, under the old elm trees.